Good morning and happy ACE week. Today's presentation is ACE in an Allo World, an exploration of the A and LGBTQIA+. A brief content warning at the bottom there for a brief mention of sexual assault, medical trauma, and invalidation. Philosopher and linguist Ferdinand de Saussure theorized that in language, things are defined by their relations with one another. Asexuality is generally defined by its relation to sexual attraction, which is the status quo. Therefore, despite this talk being mainly about a lack of something, that thing that is sexuality will be mentioned in abundance. Slide.
I can't get it to move forward, which is a bit embarrassing. There we go.
Here we go. So what is asexuality? Well, it's a sexual orientation to start, but it's also a spectrum of varying degrees of lack of sexual attraction, as we saw in the YouTube video earlier. Asexuality is to experience little or no sexual attraction to others, according to the Trevor Project. And in the Asexual Manifesto from 1972, Lisa Orlando defines it as relating sexually to no one. That sounds pretty clear and simple, I think, but there are a lot of misconceptions and some general rudeness that come along with the term, as well as with just about any identity. As you can see here on the front page, there's a picture of a person's right hand with a black ring on it. That is something that some people in the asexual community will wear to identify each other. So here's what asexuality is not. It does not mean we're plants or that we can reproduce by ourselves. It is not celibacy, which is a choice. It's not a lack of feelings of love or even a lack of libido. It is not a product of trauma. It does not indicate mental illness, despite the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders having labeled it as such in previous versions. It does not mean someone is prudish or wants to avoid any and everything that has to do with sex. These are all things I've personally heard in some of my asexual groups online, usually from testimonials of experiences with non-aces, but also from some aces, which shows how there's even misinformation and differences in experience within the community itself. Some asexuals can be described in any of these terms, and some of them do make choices based on those feelings and experiences, such as trauma. Many aces desire children, romantic relationships, and marriage, and even sexual relationships. I personally know of a few who do sex work, and many more who practice ethical non-monogamy in their romantic relationships. The only thing that is universal about asexuality is little to no sexual attraction to others. Slide. For a bit of history, ACE Week was previously Asexual Awareness Week, and it was first celebrated in 2010, the same year that the black, gray, white, and purple asexual pride flag was adopted. So is asexuality new? Kind of, and it's kind of always been around. According to the Unitarian Universalist Association's website, uua.org, asexuality is an emerging sexual orientation. I first heard the term when I was in high school, probably around 1999. So I don't know how emerging it is. So while that was fairly recent, it does mean that people had been thinking and writing about it long enough to have given it a name and spread the word such that it reached my ears in an age where some people still didn't have the internet. Some late research brought to my attention that there's actually quite an asexual history, but it's mainly been underground and unrecognized. As early as the 1860s, there are references to the terms monosexual and anesthesia sexual to refer to people who experience little to no sexual attraction or desire, which were generally lumped together back then. If you remember the sexologist, Kinsey, in the mid-20th century, who had a rating scale, he studied the prevalence of homosexuality, but he also had a category X for people with, quote, no sociosexual contacts or reactions. This ended up being about 1.5% of men and 19% of women. In 1969, the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey validates asexuality. And then in 1972, the Asexual Manifesto, a roughly 5-page treatise on the author's asexual experience, is released by Lisa Orlando. I do have a link to the original scanned document for anyone who's interested, and I'll post it in the comments later on. Here we see a clear definition of sexuality in the Asexual Manifesto, relating sexually to no one. The following year, we see activists using the term when we look at photos of pride parades. And then in 1997, a blog post, My Life as an Amoeba, was posted online, which illustrates author Zoe O'Reilly's experience as an asexual. So I'll have a link to that as well after the service. Around year 2000, the first online forums dedicated to asexuality were introduced, the first of which being based off of that blog post, My Life as an Amoeba. Okay, slide. About 3 years ago, when I began to identify as asexual myself, I didn't have any ace friends at the time that I knew of. It's estimated that only about 1% of people are ace, so this wasn't out of the realm of ordinary. So I decided to go online and look for some online groups. Not the amoeba ones, though. I don't know if those exist anymore. And I followed a few organizations and ace folks on Twitter to learn more about it. And I quickly learned the challenges that we would face. Firstly, the shocking amount of invalidation that I heard, even amongst aces, was, but especially from those they came out to, was astounding. You wouldn't think that adults would insist that another adult does not know their self after so many years of being alive in their own brain and body. Have you had your hormones checked? You just haven't found the right person. Or insisting you can't be asexual because you have children or a spouse or had a boyfriend or a girlfriend once. Or even asking extremely invasive questions about their bodies and their sex lives. These are usually the first responses ace folks hear when coming out. Some even go as far as to say that asexuality doesn't exist, which is something we laugh about together in my ace groups. And I thought it was well described in this excerpt from My Life as an Amoeba. Quote, school science books make the barest mention of our kind, and even then stick to the single-celled variety. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, asexual organisms with more than one cell don't exist. That makes it quite difficult to come to terms with your lack of sexuality. Other coming out stories, though, were more extreme. I have heard horror stories of sexual assault from someone trying to convert an ace or somehow prove that they aren't actually asexual. Coming out to a current partner can be a shock. Relationships have ended over this or have taken a downturn if the partner isn't willing or able to understand what asexuality means, or if they realize that they're sexually incompatible. Dating is a tricky situation too. You have to decide whether you want to be honest with your date and risk never seeing them again, or hide your asexuality in the beginning and hope they understand later on. There's a very real fear of being alone for lots of aces who want relationships. The term gatekeeping is used here to describe asexuals being told they're not part of the LGBTQ community by other members of the LGBTQ community. I myself don't feel like I belong to that community right now because I generally live a pretty status quo life, and being ace doesn't affect me much right now. I consider myself extremely privileged in this regard because there's a lot I don't have to deal with, but this isn't so for most aces. We're given the message that it's best to hide yourself if you're not straight. And if you're ace, it's easy, so there's no excuse. Trips to the doctor or hospital are another source of anxiety for aces. Medical professionals tend not to believe patients when they say they're not sexually active, not in a relationship, or don't desire either. So many instances of unnecessary pregnancy tests and STD testing, which the patient still has to pay for, not to mention the shame some folks feel at being subjected to these assumptions. Anyone who's tried to refuse any kind of test like this knows how difficult it can be. Many providers won't even prescribe needed medications unless we comply. The worst part really is having providers think you're lying. That trust is essential to getting effective medical care. If your doctor doesn't believe you, how can you trust that you're going to be treated for the issue you came in to start with? In religion, you'd think asexuality would be aces, but it's not. Augustine of Hippo and the Apostle Paul, among other famous Christian biblical scholars and saints, have named sex as being best reserved for the specific act of procreation, and the flesh being described negatively as lustful, sinful, and a temptation. Many believe 33-year-old Jesus was celibate and that his mother was a virgin at his birth. I don't know how much of that I believe myself. But when asked about asexuality, modern Christians, especially those who lean fundamentalist, will not hesitate to tell you how unnatural you are. Of course, it's a wife's duty to satisfy her husband and bear children, and men are expected to have urges beyond their control that ought to be satisfied in the institution of marriage. In religions such as Christianity, aces are considered sexual deviants, but not because of what we do, because of what we don't feel. If asexuality exists, then it somehow invalidates those who do have sexual attraction and who struggle to rein it in. Slide. Granted, not all ace stories are negative. So many people are accepting and validating, and some relationships are strengthened because partners understand each other better. If someone comes out to you as ace or bi or trans or gay or anything, please accept that they know themselves well enough to understand what those terms mean, and be happy for them for being able to label their differences. So let's chat about labels for a second. You may hear or think that labels are unhelpful, that we're all just individuals with individual preferences, feelings, experiences, etc., which is true, and that we all should just be happy with our unlabeled individuality. Folks who fit snugly into the status quo, and those who may be struggling with a piece of themselves that they don't really want to look at, are usually the ones that I hear saying this. And I hear it quite a bit, even from my own family. But let me tell you how invalidating that feels to us. The label does help. I, for one, don't feel like there's anything wrong with me anymore, at least not in this regard. Embracing asexuality and openly talking about it with people who have had similar experiences has helped me feel less alone, and I would still be feeling alone and weird and maybe a little bit broken if it weren't for that label. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about some of those labels. Slide. What if I'm not on the ace spectrum? Yeah, so anyone who's not asexual is allosexual. Allo means other, therefore sexually attracted to others. The A in asexual is not, therefore not sexually attracted to anyone. Slide. Okay. One of the first things that tips off an ace who doesn't yet know they're ace is the lived experience of an allosexual, especially when they divulge what it's like to feel sexual attraction. Thinking you felt sexual attraction all the time only to realize that it was something else can be surprisingly jarring. So here are some definitions that may help separate some of those terms. According to the LGBTQ Center at UNC Chapel Hill, sexual attraction is attraction that makes people desire sexual contact or shows sexual interest in another person or persons. That someone can look at another person that they've never met and decide they're interested in sexual contact with that person was not something I knew people felt. When friends at school, for example, would refer to someone as hot or sexy, what I interpreted was usually aesthetic, or our next point, romantic attraction. Romantic attraction is attraction that makes people desire romantic contact or interaction with another person or persons. Again, this is not a universal feeling. I can relate to it, and I thought it was sexual attraction for a long time. Aesthetic attraction, again from UNC Chapel Hill, occurs when someone appreciates the appearance or beauty of another person or persons disconnected from sexual or romantic attraction. This has more to do with enjoying how someone looks, and many aces, including myself, have confused this with sexual attraction. And finally, platonic attraction, according to aromanticism.org, is an interest or desire for friendship or other close relationship with another person. This is usually non-sexual and non-romantic. The difference between types of attraction may change the way an ace identifies. For example, a homoromantic asexual may feel romantic attraction to the same gender, but not sexual attraction. A heteroromantic demisexual may feel romantic attraction easily to the opposite gender, but cannot feel sexual attraction until an emotional bond is formed over a certain period of time. And you would be surprised at how long that time period may be for a demisexual. Slide. A nod to aromanticism and a note. I do not have a lived experience as an aromantic person. This is information that I have gathered through some of my ace and aro groups. And this is what I think I know. If any of it is wrong, please feel free to correct me. So aromanticism is also A in LGBTQIA+. It is experiencing little to no romantic attraction to others. Just like asexuality, aromanticism is a spectrum, and some aros desire romantic relationships while many do not. Aro ace folks experience little to no romantic and little to no sexual attraction to others. And allo romantic is someone who is romantically attracted to others. Slide. While on the subject of terms, I want to quickly explain the differences between sexual orientation, romantic orientation, and gender identity. They are all distinct from each other, but are sometimes confused. So sexual orientation is who you're sexually attracted to. Asexuality, for example, is a sexual orientation, as is anything else that ends in sexuality. Romantic orientation is who you're romantically attracted to. Aromanticism is a romantic orientation, as is any other label that ends in romantic, like hetero-romantic or bi-romantic. Gender identity, on the other hand, according to Oxford Language, is an individual person's sense of having a particular gender. This has nothing to do with who you're attracted to, but how you identify. For example, cisgender, transgender, non-binary, and agender are some of the types of gender identity. Slide. So why do we need to know this? To start with, we're UUs. As a progressive, welcoming church, we need to know our congregants. We must allow a space for everyone to not only be safe, but to be brave, to echo a term I heard at seminary. To do this, and to do it well, we have to know when our responses and behaviors are harmful and how to react in a way that folks truly feel welcome. Even progressive spaces harbor some bias or ignorance, and it's up to us to make space for learning, which I think we're actually really doing a good job of here at Mosaic. To fulfill the 7 principles, validating people's experiences, even when we don't understand them, is pertinent. It makes us feel groundless and helpless and uncomfortable, not knowing what someone is going through sometimes or how to respond. But we have to embrace those feelings and allow discomfort in ourselves without trying to fix anything. This is as much as a reminder to you as to myself. We must understand that people come to us seeking out a religious or spiritual community after suffering rejection or abuse at the hands of another, and asexuals are definitely not immune to that. Many of us came to Unitarian Universalism or Mosaic as a person healing from religious trauma, and we need not forget what that felt like in those raw, vulnerable times. We need to know all this because to be human is to express ourselves, our uniqueness, and our individuality. Our culture has focused on sexual expression increasingly throughout the last several decades in feminism, free speech, and anti censorship, the movement to legalize sex work, and womanism. This is not a bad thing. Media has become more and more liberal with its exploration of sexual expression. I'm reading the works of theologians like Pamela Lightsey and M. Sean Copeland, who are embracing the idea of sexual expression and sex acts, specifically those from LGBTQ folks, as means of expressing gratitude to God for creating them in God's image. But if sexual expression is our humanness or even our spirituality, then not expressing ourselves sexually and not feeling it should be equally so. To Saussure's point, I'm defining even human expression in terms of its relations to others. We need to know about asexuality and other orientations and identities for the sake of community. As I mentioned before, finding a community of other aces, even if they're all online, was something that helped me combat loneliness. A community of understanding, validating friends who are not ace is just as important. Understanding myself by relating to others' experiences really makes all the difference. And finally, we're a congregation that loves social justice. We know that any identity outside of the status quo, even ones like asexuality, which has been referred to as the invisible orientation in some circles, will encounter resistance and discrimination, as I've explained. It's up to us to be open-minded, active listeners and advocates for the sake of dignity and on the basis of love. May it be so.